Thanks everybody for coming out. So I guess we can probably get started with introductions. My name is Nishan Kulatilaka. I am from Merck, from the Applied Technology group there. The charter for our group is to look at the disruptive technologies in healthcare, ideally in the life sciences, of course, being a manufacturer. And I'm in charge of the blockchain group. And we've been at it now for about 2 years, run a lot of different proof of concepts, and for the most part, we've tried to keep to ourselves, and we're doing now, and at least over the past 9 months or so, is really starting to branch out and figure out where we can make the right partnerships, and obviously venues like this are pretty perfect for that. And yeah, we're joined by a great group of panelists here. We have Dominique, we have Mark, and we have Fredric, and I will let you guys introduce yourselves.
Thanks, Nishan. Hi, everybody. I'm Dominique Hurley. I'm Vice President at a company called HealthVerity, where I'm in charge of innovation and partnerships. And HealthVerity is disrupting the way that you access and purchase healthcare information. And we do that via a technology platform that provides a marketplace that allows you to come in and search and pull a cohort that you're interested in. And underneath that is a technology that creates an interoperable patient identification key that allows us to tie data across a variety of healthcare data sets. We have about 300 million patients and about 9 billion healthcare transactions currently in the marketplace, and customers are accessing it today. Prior to HealthVerity, I was at Biogen, where I ran global commercial information, and I was responsible for the acquisition and use of information, including governance, technology applications, and driving innovation around that information.
Thanks, Dominique. Good morning, everyone. My name is Mark Treshock. I'm with IBM. I'm part of our Global Business Services Group, which is our consulting group. And within that, I focus on life sciences and healthcare. And within that, I focus on Internet of Things and blockchain projects. And IBM is one of the sponsors, is the sponsor of this track. And let me just thank you all for coming this morning. I think it will be a great discussion. Fredric.
Hi, my name is Fredric Santiago, and I am the Associate Director for Health Information Technology at Boehringer Ingelheim. I have a background in medicine. I'm a practicing internist and have training in clinical informatics. A couple of years ago, Boehringer realized that we needed to have more expertise internally with regard to health information technology, and the idea being to help our customers and the populations that are specific to our therapeutic area of interest. And so they birthed an HIT team, and we've been working to integrate it into BI over the last year. And we are looking forward to working with a lot of you and our customers in terms of innovation and in terms of transferring paper assets to digital. I am the lead in a think tank in BI looking at blockchain in terms of use cases in pharma. And so I'm happy to be here and look forward to the conversation.
Great, thank you all. So before we jump into questions, I want to talk a little bit about the topic and why I think we all feel that it's really important. Often when you think about the life sciences or you think about pharma and blockchain, the topics that come most to mind are going to be in clinical trials, they're going to be in manufacturing and supply chain. And those are two astronomical business cases for us to explore, and they're of course worth exploring and worth executing on. But it's also important not to lose sight of what the core of our mission is, right? Which is to invent new medicines, new therapies, new vaccines. And as we start to think more about what blockchain can do and the paradigm shift that it has for how we interact with data, how we think about data, I feel that it's very important to not lose sight of what it is that we're ultimately trying to do, which is to improve patient lives, improve patient outcomes, and thinking about how we can really bring the patient closer to science, and really how we can interact with them in ways that we couldn't potentially before, be it for legislative or regulatory reasons, or just because we felt it was too risky in other situations. So with that, I think it's probably best to start with an example or a case study of where we've seen this put into practice a little bit. And Mark, I'd like to start off with you. And if you could tell us a little bit about what IBM's been doing in this space. There was a big announcement about 9 months ago, sometime early 2017 or late 2016, about the work that you've been doing with the FDA.
Yeah, thank you. So IBM and the FDA are working together on a pilot program. And within IBM, this is with our Watson Health Group. So the part of Watson that focuses on healthcare and life sciences, and the blockchain team. So those two groups are working with the FDA to create a platform for secure and efficient exchange of patient data, right? So the initial project, the initial proof of concept, will start with oncology patients and oncology-related data, and it will integrate data from EMRs, clinical trials, if there are any, genomic data, mobile data, and data collected from IoT devices, and exogenous data, such as weather information, for example. We'll integrate all of that together into a platform and use blockchain to allow the patient or the owner of that data to mediate how it's used and where it goes. So why that would be important is, for example, if you are a patient and you're under a treatment, a particularly expensive treatment from a pharmaceutical company, they will assign to you a case manager, right, to help make sure that you follow the protocol, to help monitor for adverse events, and if there are any, to try to reconcile what's going on, right, between the drug they're taking from them and the whole constellation of other things that you might be taking, right? So with this, for example, imagine in this scenario where the patient can allow for sharing of select data, right, to that case manager, right, which will make this process hopefully easier, right, and produce better outcomes for the patient. And what's exciting about working with the FDA is that many parties in industry are reluctant, right, beyond dipping a toe in the water to move forward with this without the government's approval or the government's okaying it. We're saying they're not okay, and that would end it. But this is very exciting. We've been doing it for about 9 months now, and I think in the fall sometime, we'll start to see the initial results will be made available publicly. Yeah, so stay tuned.
Yeah, that's great. And I'll open it up to the rest of my manufacturing colleagues in a second. But I mean, that's really something that's exciting for me and for us at Merck, right? Because when we think about how we traditionally have to interact with data now, often it's through large data brokers. We're not able to get information from the patients, and patients that could be willingly interested in participating, right? And there's a level of granularity that just is not often attainable now, especially at a very personalized level. And I think for how most of us probably view the future of medicine, that's going to be a pretty necessary component. And I don't want to hog that. Yeah.
I can't hear him too well. I can't hear you very well.
You can't hear him?
No, I'm not hearing him very well.
I think it's going to be interesting to see what comes after that, right? And how you can involve manufacturers and how you can start programs that are sort of outside of the FDA and are just in commercial environments. Yeah. Because, of course, HIPAA sets forth the standards and we can operate within them. And we don't necessarily need the FDA to approve it, but it's great to have the endorsement of it. So I think it's a smart move to get them behind it to start, but quickly moving into the commercialization of it,
That's what we hope. That's what we hope. Yeah. Certainly their endorsement would go a long way to convincing industry to move quickly in this space.
Mm-hmm.
Great. So Fredric, I'm hoping that this is carrying.
Yeah, for some reason.
Yeah. No, but we're curious to get your thoughts on, what changes when we as pharmaceutical companies are able to get patient-level information, right? We're no longer dealing with things at the aggregate. We're no longer dealing with that 35,000-foot view. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, one thing that comes immediately to mind is, let me just lay a little background here first. I guess most of you know we're data rich, but we're data rich in a very specific way in that we have information out of randomized controlled clinical trials. We recognize that we're really in need of being able to validate that with real-world experience. And so one of the drivers for us in terms of, assisting our customers and maturing their experience with health information technology is to be able to tap into information that's embedded in EHRs.
Right.
So I guess everybody in the room knows that that's a major issue today. And so, you know, we're very focused on that piece of it as well. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I guess I'd like to shift gears a little bit. You know, we think about things, or at least right now perhaps, purely on the clinical side, right, and on the research-driven side. But the reality is that there are other opportunities out there. And Dominique, I'd like to start with you here, especially given your experience at Biogen. You know, what are some of the other opportunities that we should be looking out for, be it in marketing or commercial spaces?
Sure. Yeah, there's quite a few. There's two that are really large ones, and then one that's interesting to think about from a future state standpoint. When I was at Biogen, I was responsible for all of the specialty pharmacy information management. So because we have a specialty drug, products have to sit through a supply chain and work through pharmacies that deliver them directly to the door of the patient, often accompanied with training and patient services that are helping that patient stay compliant and you know, get on their therapy and stay on their therapy. And because I was in charge of the information, I really understood, and we had a closed network, I was able to really witness how long it took to actually get a patient on therapy. And our company tried very hard to shorten that cycle. There's a lot of attention paid to it. Many people were judged in the pharmacies themselves on how quickly they could convert patients. But there came a point when they just simply couldn't do any better. And so we really took a look at that operational flow. And when we did, we found greater than 50 steps that it takes to get a patient on therapy, between benefits investigations that are done multiple times across multiple pharmacies based on payer acknowledgement, financial assistance, dynamics, actually getting that drug shipped to the patient itself. And it was really burdensome to the point where some patients would age out and simply never get on therapy, which these are very sick people, and it's really a travesty. So I think that blockchain could do a lot to tie that process together. There's a lot of the great dynamics that our colleague from Optum talked about last night, and a lot of those filters. You know, there's contracts that have to be in place. There's data that has to move and be governed. There's cost to all of that. There's the need to move fast. And that's a perfect application for blockchain. In fact, I was evangelizing that in my company before I left to join HealthVerity. The second place I think that there's a lot of opportunity is a little left of the patient, but still a really important part of the commercial mix, which is the rebate and contracting process between market access and the rest of the players out there. It's a very burdensome process. There's legacy technology that is very heavy to install. It's hard to manage. It's hard to validate. And I think it's a great opportunity because those transactions are fairly simple. You can look at things like a diagnosis and say that, therefore, you know, if this diagnosis has existed, then, the patient should be on therapy, and thus this unit should be dispensed. And that kind of a process in support of contracting, reporting, and payments of all the surrounding the ecosystem could work really well. And then the final place I think there's a lot of opportunity is in consent and patient management. It's another big hot button at Biogen globally, of course, because of all the law over there, both for patient and for HCP. So it's interesting to think about practitioner identification, and connected to that should be practitioner consent and how they've informed consent or other. And if we're thinking about Europe, and then in the States themselves on the patient side, there's certainly HIPAA consent, there's marketing consent. There's a variety of companies that have to interact with the patient on behalf of a manufacturer, on behalf of, a doctor's practice. And so if there's a way for blockchain to integrate that with patient identity, I think that's a really important thing to be thinking about, is patient identity connected to consent.
Great.
There's an opportunity there as well.
Yeah, and I'm curious for all of you, do you see this as an opportunity? Obviously, the value is tremendous for us in the life sciences and pharmaceutical space. Certainly there's opportunity out there for others as well. Do you feel that this is an area that needs to be driven by pharmaceuticals and life sciences companies, or in the end, does it really not make a difference? This is something that we internally have certainly gone back and forth on a bit.
I think there's a couple ways it could happen, right? It certainly could be driven by industry, and that would be compelling. I'm a firm believer in the efficiency aspect of blockchains, where using blockchain-based processes can reduce the complexity and cost of going through some of these processes by an incredible amount. In some cases and other use cases, we're seeing the cost of a process reduced by 80%. Right? So what could we do in the industry with that extra money? Right? Employ it towards research or care for a hospital or something other than kind of reconciling disputes between each other. And industry can certainly be a driver of this. I think the government can be a driver of it too, because there's a tremendous cost pressure, right, in our health system. So can they? Yes, but will they? Will they begin to mandate or direct government agencies to explore blockchain-based solutions for some of these applications? I hope so, right? Because I think it will free up a lot of money that could be better spent than it is now.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, that's absolutely, I think, we are certainly driven in that direction. And then, how far we can go really depends upon the regulatory environment that we operate in. We've got issues around that we've had to tackle trying to help our customers in the HIT space around fair market value and transfer of value issues, pharma code and this type of thing. And so we are restricted in some ways. And it's my hope that, we'll start to see some of that lessened, in a way in which a similar situation occurred some years back. I think all of you remember when this electronic health record thing hit the market and all physicians were required to do it. Hospitals couldn't help physicians, procure them or develop them. And when that rule, and they realized that if hospitals did not help, the likelihood that physicians were going to do it was low because the return on the investment was not there, no incentive to do it. So I'm hoping that ultimately was relaxed, I think, as many of you physicians out there remember. So I'm hoping that we'll start to see some of that happening in the regulatory environment between pharma and some of our partners in the healthcare industry. I think clearly the complexities that exist to make this happen are too great for any of us to do it alone. And I think to partner is going to be key for us to reach where we want to be ultimately.
Yeah.
If I could just push a little bit on your comment, there's been many times when I was not at Biogen on the supplier side trying to talk to manufacturers about purchasing efficiency technologies, and there's no quicker way to kill a deal than to talk about efficiency. So I really feel like if we want commercial and the manufacturers world to embrace this, we have to show them how it's going to drive revenue or drive innovation or drive market, because efficiency alone won't do the trick. And I know you well enough to know that you care about more than that, of course. But, and that's certainly not where you're only focusing. I think that I think we do need funding from manufacturers to get behind it. And I think to do that, we have to come up with specific tactical places where it can drive change in a meaningful way, really to drive share and to drive patient success. Mm-hmm. Those are two factors that the manufacturer cares deeply about.
Yeah, and I think that I would add on there, especially when thinking of it through a blockchain lens, right, is to think about those opportunities that also have some sort of inherent trust problem buried within them, right? And this kind of gets to what you were talking before about, be it a regulatory reason or a compliance reason. But a lot of those regulations are in there because of some underlying trust issue or trust problem. And I mean that perhaps not in the social sense, but at least in the more blockchain or distributed sense.
Yeah. And we are seeing traction with companies in industry on issues that are top of mind in the C-suite, right, around this, and how this technology may be able to use to address that. So for example, controlled substances. The controlled substances, the opioid epidemic, right, in the country. It's a huge issue. It's a huge public health issue. Now the government is starting to push into fixing it, right? They're starting to fine distributors, pharmacies. They just fine the pharmaceutical manufacturer. So this is clearly a message that if industry doesn't get together and solve this on our own, the government will solve it for us in a way that we might not want, right? So we're seeing traction on that because it's top of mind in the C-suite.
Right.
There's a lot of momentum around
Yeah.
it now.
Yep.
Fredric, I want to get back to something that you were mentioning before about some of the struggles that we have with EHR, EMR data. I used to work at Epic, full disclosure, so don't let that influence anything that you're about to say. But I'd like to sort of expand that a little bit to HIEs and health information exchanges, and talk a little bit about how you think either this blockchain technology could be applied in that, or how that type of thinking could be applied. Because we look at HIEs right now as, or we would like them to be some sort of aggregated center of truth for as a data broker, but the reality is that that's not what ends up happening.
Sure. Well, I have to take off my BI hat and put on my physician hat to answer that question, and I know I'm going to come right to the seat of some of us who are out here having to deal with it. And there's some differences in terms of what states do in terms of the HIE piece and how they're set up and how they're funded, and so I won't sit here and propose that I'm going to be accurate with regard to every state, so I'll just stick to Texas. And of course, the feds funded the development of these exchanges in order to foster interoperability. And by and large, I think as of this year, there was a survey out that showed that they actually are still missing their mark in terms of being able to provide information reliably. Some of that has to do with technology failures. Some of it has to do with human factors. And a part of it has to do, at least where I'm at, where I live, with physicians' hesitance to participate. So why is that? Well, it costs money. Some of these systems are set up such that they've received initial funding, but they are required to stand on their own going forward. And I think some of us are a little bit hesitant about investing in something that might go away. The reliability of the information that comes across, I think most of us realize is not there. So we all need a way, and we need a way, when I'm talking to physicians and providers, we need a way to be able to have more confidence in the reliability of the information and completeness of the information that we receive. We need a way for whatever that solution is to meet our business model. In other words, overlay over top of legacy systems and not require us to spend more money on new interfaces and new equipment. So I think blockchain fits into that format and is fairly attractive from that standpoint.
Yeah, I think about perhaps one of the simpler examples of that, which is vaccine registries or immunization registries, and some of the trouble that we see, at least in this country, about how the data won't carry over state lines, and we think about how a distributed architecture could play so well into that type of a space potentially, right? And I'd be curious to get your thoughts as to certainly, well, it doesn't have to be in a vaccine-specific situation, but that ability to connect records is something that we certainly see as valuable, and it really gets to that completeness that you were talking about, because the life sciences have been around for a long time, right? There aren't too many low-hanging fruit that we're going to get from high-level EMR information, especially if it's not going to be complete, not just for an individual patient, but for a given region, especially when we think about, as we either work through ACOs or as we think about things in more public health context. So I don't know if you guys have any.
Well, a few things come to mind. At HealthVerity, we're creating this interoperable patient ID. And yesterday, Micah talked about the concept of the exhaust that the patient creates. I love that term. And the fact that the patient is has a lot of information that's out there. And if we have one version of the truth, then that truth has value, and then that value is connected to the supply and demand of the available information. And that all combines to present an interesting opportunity to think about how information can be exchanged through the blockchain. So if there was one place where we all went, regardless of whether it was HIE-based or not, to go get that particular transaction at that point in time for that patient. That would both smooth out the operational burden, but it would also present greater value to the patients that might control that data or to the person that's looking for it. And so the fact that HealthVerity today is out there providing this interoperable view shows you that there's a market for it and a big need. And it's not just in support of registry management, it's in support of across the entire enterprise. People are coming for that interoperable patient view. So I think blockchain, connected to that could support the business process of accessing and using data like that, and it could also support the validation and the access rates. So it solves a whole lot of problems around the ability to take interoperable data and put it to work. And the monetary and the monetization possibilities there are pretty broad for, again, the patient, the supplier of the data, and the transparency in the user who's buying or using that data.
Yeah, here's another example of a project we're doing. It's much earlier stage than the one with the FDA, but this is for a manufacturer of vaccines. And so it started as using blockchain to track the efficacy, so the storage of the vaccine and the delivery to the point of dispensing. But then, because they're doing this in the emerging world, right, there really are poor medical records that are kept. So we expanded the blockchain network, to do that, to keep track of people and what vaccines they received. And that started as just tracking it for continuing doses of the vaccine to make sure they got the full course of the treatment. But then it went beyond that to include vaccines for tracking this information to help the movement of people, right, around the world. So when people are moving from the emerging world to the emerged world, the developed world, whatever you want to call it, oftentimes they have to prove a vaccination history to cross a border, right? Particularly now, we see with Zika and Ebola. How do you do that if you come from a country? Thank you. How do you do that if you come from a country that doesn't have great medical records? Right? Blockchain can solve that problem, right? So making that system available to border crossing agents so that these people can prove vaccination history as they cross borders. So what's really fascinating about this is how, it's like pulling on a thread and everything ties together, right? It started as a supply chain problem and ended as an immigration problem, right?
Solution.
With a solution, right? With medical records in between.
Yeah.
So it's
a great example.
It's incredible, yeah.
And I think something that's really embedded in that, and to be fair, it's embedded in a lot of what we're looking at as folks in the pharma industry, is identity, right?
Yeah.
And whether we're thinking about it in the context of HIPAA, whether we're just thinking about it in the context of being able to do the connecting of data sets that I was talking about, certainly in a situation like you were talking about for immigration, something that's going to be completely vital. I'm curious to get your thoughts on this, because ultimately we have, when we think about blockchain, we know that there is this incredible sense of digital identity that is just baked in, right? At least in the traditional sense. And there's such a conceptual fit that's there, but we also have to kind of walk this tightrope of, what becomes too transparent, what becomes not. I'll start there because I can talk about that for far too long.
Yeah, sure. So, first, it's important to think about what gets stored on the chain versus what doesn't get stored on the chain, right? And the concept of an ID and how that ID is created and becomes the immutable identity of the person. Honestly, I've been thinking a lot about it and asking a lot of folks. I still don't understand consensus-driven identity. At the end of it, there has to be an algorithm. There has to be math that's done to connect this, and create this ID. So I think really centering on how exactly an ID can be created, figuring out how that ID can be standardized across all blockchain applications. Companies like PocketDoc that are creating applications, layers that you can write to and have modules sitting on top of. The concept of an ID module that would perpetuate across all uses for blockchain, I think would be a really important thing to think about.
I'm good. Why don't you tell us some of the stuff you're doing at Merck? Put you on the hot spot.
Sure. So we're going, our vendor actually presented about this at last year's Distributed. But we had worked with Blockchain Health to think about how we could rethink how we do clinical trials, right? Where there's this opportunity for either informed consent or just overall data management, and increasing that level of accountability that we have, and how could blockchain play a role in that, right? And this kind of gets back to trust problems that we were thinking about before. Now, obviously, there are processes in place for us to submit to the FDA, and that's all well and good, but that doesn't mean that we can't improve across that, be it either for efficiency, just improve value. We have a better line of sight potentially into the data that we're working with. And ultimately, really, that big picture goal is how can we improve the process for the folks that are involved? And that's not just us sitting as the life sciences, medicinal provider, but how does it work for CROs? How does it work for the patient at the end? How can we create that as a better experience and hopefully be able to extend that to either recruiting or being able to invite them in for other research projects? The opportunities really expand out from there.
No, that's interesting. That's cool.
Yeah. And I think one thing that we've really seen is that there are so many common patterns, and it extends if you're thinking about something as simple as electronic signature and being able to take properties of immutability, and whether it's applying that for just signing some sort of consent document or applying that same pattern into supply chain, right? The sign-off as it passes from manufacturer to distributor to pharmacy to patient, or however the supply chain is configured. And the nice thing is that thanks to folks like you guys who are making all of this open source, right, we get to play around with this in a way that perhaps we wouldn't have been able to with other emerging technologies, right? This isn't like quantum or VR where we have to spend amounts of money that I won't get into, and to be able to test the waters here. There's a lot of chances for us to really go and explore, and I think we've been pretty successful in doing that, and we're really now at a point where we can try to hammer down on what do we want to go after and execute, and try to do it at scale, because that's really where we see the power of this and where you would just inherently get involved with distributed architectures.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. It's like the internet in 1999, right? For better or worse, but it's an opportunity to experiment, right? And the platforms are generally available for people to do that. The one IBM works with Hyperledger is, and the others are as well. So that's great.
Yeah. So I'd like to run back to some of the identity topics we were talking about before, and kind of expand it to what is probably out in the future, but really not too far away, which is dealing with information or data that in itself is identifiable, right? So certainly in the life sciences, we're thinking about genomics and how we can incorporate that more into our thinking, into our science. And we've been playing around a lot, or thinking about, at least internally, how do we design systems that are going to preserve that element of identity, right, at the digital level, but also protect or keep in mind the fact that the information that is ultimately being involved, if that is out there, it can't be in the public space because you're going to know who it is. That's just the nature of the science. And I'd be curious to know what you guys think about that space, and as we see it pop up more and more, and it seems like an avenue where perhaps in the not too distant future is a great opportunity for us in the life sciences to interact directly with patients. But obviously there's some pretty key hurdles there that are going to be absolute deal breakers if we can't get them right.
It's interesting, particularly with genomics as an example, and with all of this, because patients are sharing people are sharing their health data with each other now, right? Completely outside of the industry. So we think about something like 23andMe, right, where they take a sample of your genomic data and sequence it, and they run analysis on it. How effective is that? What will it lead to, other than telling me who my ancestors are? I don't know, but people are sharing genetic data, right? And I don't know if you could individually identify a person simply from that genetic sample, because it's not the full genome, it's a subset. But even if you could, I think there probably are people who would be okay with that, right? As long as they know what they're consenting to, right? And they understand the possible benefit of it. They would be okay with sharing that data. So I think it's absolutely the right thing to try to make the data completely secure and unidentifiable. But if you look at the thousands of terabytes of health and medical data that get generated,
it's not realistic.
it may not be possible. So we need to focus on making it as secure as we can, but then also just explaining to people what they're consenting to. And that may be enough, right? It may have to be enough, right, for us to move forward.
Yeah, I think when I think of putting my genome on the blockchain, the thing that would make me most comfortable doing that is to know that we can layer other levels of security on top of the blockchain. In other words, there's all types of techniques, from tokenization to obfuscation to, that's the cool thing about it, is that you can add whatever layer of security you think is required, and it's friendly in that space. So,
I was lucky enough to have dinner last night with one of the foremost privacy experts from Vanderbilt. He told me, without a doubt, very emphatically, that genomic data is not personally identifiable. It's not an identifier. It should not be considered as an identifier. It's a piece of health information. I think somebody yesterday was saying that genomic data is actually PII. And he was quite clear that in fact is not the case. But that said, I think what's really important when you think about any of this information and how blockchain will support us is that you have the patient behind the effort. And when at the beginning of this session, I told you about my experiences at Biogen trying to shorten the cycle to get patients on therapy. And one of the meetings that I had as I was driving that through the enterprise was meeting with the National MS Society. And they recognized this problem, and they were very excited to think about how blockchain could tackle the problem. And we're going to be the voice to the patient, to be sure that the patient could support the endorsement of their information moving around the chain in order to get them on therapy faster. So if any of you have been in the specialty market, you know that when a doctor writes a prescription, they don't just send it to the EMR. It's a referral, basically, and there's a lot of stuff that has to happen before it turns into an order that can actually be shipped. And on that referral, and in that, whether it be electronic or paper, the patient signs several times releasing a lot. They release HIPAA rights, they release rights for contact. There's a lot that they do because they're very sick and they need all the help they can get to get on therapy. Being really transparent about the benefit of information moving around freely and actually thinking about how, and this is very future state, but thinking about how the patient can benefit beyond, getting the drug in hand is important as it relates to supporting privacy and privacy management.
Yeah.
So I think consent is a really critical part of that.
Yeah, I'd like to actually pass this over to Fredric too, as being in the clinical space, obviously as a clinician, as a physician. How does that shift how you could potentially interact with your patients, right? If they're able to have more control and more stewardship over their data.
Yeah, it sounds very attractive. I think it's a buzzword in terms of, giving the patient control, but I have some hairs stand up on the back of my neck a little bit about this, and I think we have some issues we're going to need to solve before we think about that. For instance, I see faces of people who would want some information that I may have posted on their record removed. What happens when you can't? If patients and folks typically are pretty sensitive about what's on their record. And there's some things that one of my physician colleagues pointed out to us yesterday that we will put on a record to remind us, to remind ourselves, to revisit an issue. Sometimes patients don't want to think that they may need a psychiatrist, right, or that they may have been abused by their spouse, or that you're thinking, I think this person's on drugs.
Right.
So, the record is designed, this is the thing, the record originally was designed as a tool to remind us of our observations. Now, you put that on you put that on an immutable record, and if the patient has control, what happens? And the question becomes, how much control? Do they, and because, I think, this whole I mean, the way blockchain can function, I mean, you can control access at the aggregate level or the element. So you can get really down in the weeds and block access to certain things that you may not like. So what happens when that information that I'm sending to a referral source to help me decide whether this is the case, not allowed to see it? So I think we're going to have to think a little bit more about how these things are going to be structured and what the relationship's going to be like, what the legal ramifications would be.
Right.
You know, because if that's not solved, we're not putting it on there. And what does that do to the free flow of information and data that you get on the other side? If I'm thinking this is one thing and I haven't documented it, what's the quality of the data like? So there's a lot of issues around that. And ultimately, I may sound like a little bit negative, but mostly I'm for it. I just want to control how you deal with it.
No, it's a good point, because certainly being on the life sciences side, right? If you're not getting that complete set of information, then you really lose a tremendous amount of value.
Right.
So we're coming up against the clock. We have about a minute left. Can we quickly expand this for maybe one or two questions?
Yeah, I'm Jonathan here from WebShield and the EP3 Foundation. And Fredric, I really appreciated your comments, because I think as an industry, we've been dodging this identity and privacy problem forever. And if you think about what's really necessary in clinical trials and clinical research and precision medicine and pay-for-value reimbursement, you really need to get a comprehensive profile of the patient, their behavioral, lifestyle, everything. You have all these different systems where they have different identifiers for the same person. So if you can't agree, you're talking about the same patient, data off this device, that clinical, that labs, that system, or that consent form, you really can't get valid consent unless you can agree authoritatively that consent form is about that same subject from these hundreds of different sources. There's really two ways to be able to pull data globally. This is either consent or de-identification under HIPAA. It's not a valid consent unless you can authoritatively say that this consent form is that person. So that we can't agree on identities right now, so that won't work. De-identification, I'll totally disagree with whoever this Vanderbilt guy is. You know, if you have genomic information in a record, you can always re-identify it. In fact, you can always re-identify records with enough subject stuff out there if you have enough reference data out there. So you'll always be able to re-identify the data. It's not even difficult. So there's really no global way of pooling comprehensive profiles about a patient unless you can both, obfuscate the data, so you can't reveal any information and do an analytics at the same time. So unless we resolve that, we're just whistling Dixie. And for 10 years in this industry, we just dodged identity and authorization, and that's why we have these silos. So I was wondering your thoughts on that. Do you have an approach to actually, is there any promising technologies out there you guys are aware of to actually resolve the global identity and sharing problem and consent and regulatory compliance so that Fredric can be comfortable using this technology?
I'm sorry. Could you do that question to me?
So I think the question was, is there any technology out there that truly provides an interoperable, de-identified method for us to have access to as much information as we need? Is that correct?
Yeah, eliminating conflict with privacy.
Right.
Unless you eliminate it, getting consent.
Right. Right. So I'm going to take a stab at this, and shameless plug for HealthVerity, because we offer de-identified, interoperable patient identification across all the data right now. But how do you tie that to consent? We don't need patient consent because it's de-identified, right? You need patient consent if you're going to get identifiable information and use it with that information connected to it. So I don't know if any of you all have other comments on that.
So that's if that is true, I assume it is, it's a new type of data problem that we haven't dealt with en masse yet, right?
It's incredibly difficult to do.
It's incredibly difficult to do, yeah. And how do we do that? And how do we do that balanced against now really the potential of things like CRISPR, right? Or quantum computing, right? To fold proteins and do incredible things with genomic data and analysis.
And that I don't have an answer to, right? It may be that people are willing to live with the risk of being able to be identified back to their Facebook profile from their genome, right? In order to gain the benefits that this offers, right? But it's a great point, and it's an incredibly difficult problem.
Great. All right, well, we're a few minutes over, and I don't want to throw everybody off schedule. But I want to thank our panelists for joining us today, and for all of you for joining us in this session.
Thank you, Nishan.
Thank you for
Thank you for